So, you just open your amazing new fancy professional camera. So how do you go from taking pictures like this to taking pictures like this? So if you have a phone and you're trying to learn photography on your phone, there's really not many settings you can change on your phone. But if you download Adobe Lightroom for free on the iOS App Store and also on the Google Play Store, you can change settings like shutter speed and ISO. More on those later. Now, all of you with the DSLR or mirrorless camera, Nikon, Canon, Fujifilm, Pentax, Sony, anything like that, pick it up, make sure you turn it on, and make sure a lens is attached. So attaching a lens is really simple. So first what you do is, I'm just going to take off my lens for this demo. You have your camera body and you have your lens, right? So your lens will have like a white marking right there. I don't know if you can see that, but it has a little white marking, like a white dot. And your camera will also have a white dot, something like that right around there next to the lens, mount. And what you're going to do is you're going to line up those two white dots together. Line up those two white dots together, and you're just going to twist until it snaps. And that is twisting counterclockwise. So you're going to twist counterclockwise until it snaps. Let me show you that one more time. So I'm going to remove the lens, and you're going to line up the two white dots. I don't know if you can see that white dot though. Yeah, I'm going to line up the two white dots, and I think you can see the white dots right there, and I'm lining it up with my camera's white dot. And you just twist and you'll hear a little click and your lens is mounted. Removing it is simple. You just click this little lens release button. It's on most cameras. You just click it and you twist your camera clockwise. Just remember to keep the camera facing downward when you're attaching a lens, because dust can get on the sensor, and that's super annoying because you have to clean it off and it'll show up in your pictures. So your camera should be on. Here we go. I can show you my camera is on. And my camera is showing a lens retracted error right there. And the way to get rid of that is basically to extend your lens. So some lenses, or most of them, will have this kind of button on it. That's your lens lock button. You're just going to hold that and twist your lens towards the numbers. I have little numbers over here. So you're going to twist your lens towards the numbers, and once you get past the first number on your lens, it's going to be something like 18 or 55 or whatever. Something like that, and that error should go away, well, for whichever camera you have. So now you should see your screen, and you should see three values on the screen. So your screen should look something like this, with three just numbers over here. So one of those numbers is going to be a fraction, another number is going to be like a decimal or a whole number with maybe an F next to it, and the last number will be something with ISO next to it. 100, 200, 3000, something like that, and it's probably changing if it's on auto mode. And these three values are really what you need to know about to learn the fundamentals of photography. Now, in order to stop your mind from absolutely becoming jelly due to the rapidly changing values on auto mode, which is probably what your camera is on, I would suggest changing it to manual mode. And if you don't know how to do that, check your camera's manual, but for most cameras you're gonna have like a knob right there, and make sure just to switch it, keep on turning it until the M is facing towards the dot, or whatever the selection indicator is on your camera. So make sure it says M, and my camera screen also says M over here. So just make sure that's your manual mode, and make sure that you're manually controlling almost everything in the camera. Otherwise, when you move the camera around, the values will very rapidly change, and it's just going to be super annoying. So I'm going to put the camera aside for now, as we talk about the three most important values I showed you: that fraction, that decimal, and that ISO, or 100, 200, 300. So that first one is your shutter speed, and the shutter speed basically represents how long the camera is exposing itself to light for each picture. Now what those fractions mean is that's the fraction of a second that the camera is exposing itself. So you can have 1 by 1000, which would mean the camera has a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second. Now that's pretty fast. Some people might think that's not a lot of light getting into the camera, like 1/1000th of a second. How much light can your eye capture from that, right? It's actually quite a lot, although you can have shutter speeds like 1/60th of a second, 1/40th of a second. And even though these are very fast for us to comprehend way too fast, the slow-mo guys have a great video on showing how a mechanical shutter works, or if you have a mirrorless camera, it's an electronic shutter. So you can see exactly how, that camera is controlling that exposure to light. But basically what it means is that's the fraction of a second that the camera's shutter speed is. So that next number is the decimal, which is called our aperture. Now the aperture is kind of like the pupil of our eye. It dilates and expands and in order to adjust for the amount of light that's coming into it. If you've noticed, when you're in a bright room, your pupil will be very small, and if you're in a really dark room, your pupil will expand because it needs to let more light in. And that's the same thing that the pupil in your camera is doing, the aperture. It's letting more or less light in based on the lighting conditions you have around you. And you can look at this chart I'll show up on the screen. You can see that the higher the aperture number, when you go 5, 6, 7, 8, the narrower that pupil gets, and the lower it is, the larger that pupil gets. Now finally we have the ISO. Now as far as I know, there's no real thing that this stands for, like an acronym. It doesn't stand for anything that I could find online. If you have an idea what it could stand for, put it down in the comments, because I have no idea. What the ISO is controlling is the sensitivity of your sensor to light. And what that means is when your ISO is really low, like 100 or 200, your camera won't capture as much as the light as if your camera's ISO is at 25,000 or 30,000 or whatever, some big number. So the higher that ISO goes, the more light it captures. It's not exactly controlling how much light is coming into your camera. It's more amplifying the light at a different scale. So a higher ISO will amplify that light. And now what comes with amplifying that light is something called noise or grain in your photos. And although it's always there, even at 100, you're gonna have grain in your photos. You just can't see it with the naked eye. The higher you put that ISO, the more that noise will be amplified along with the rest of the pixels in the picture, and you'll see that kind of those colorful dots come up in your pictures. That's not a defect in your camera, it's just what cameras do. And this usually happens in low light, because in low lights you'll need higher sensitivity of your sensor to light, so your picture's brighter, so you'll get noise. And this noise can obviously be removed in post-processing of photo to a certain extent, but believe it or not, some people actually add grain. Like some people add grain to videos to give it a cinematic look, just like when we used to take film cameras and film videos. They used to add a little grain in there now that we have digital cameras, so it looks like those film cameras. Or people just like a little grain to give a certain effect, but usually, when you're taking the actual photo, the less grain, the better. Although these three values are completely different and they do completely different things, there's one thing that they all affect, and that is light. Now, there's a reason this is called photography, photo, which meaning light, and graphy, which I have no idea what that means. But you can see it as the science or art of light. So understanding exactly what each parameter, the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO does to that light is very vital in becoming a good photographer, because you need to know how to change these values and manipulate these values in order for each situation that you come across while you're taking your photos. And once you get to know these values even better, you'll be able to look at a subject. It's like, oh, I know exactly what shutter speed to use, what aperture to use, what ISO to use. So as we said, that shutter speed is how long your camera is exposed to light, and naturally, as you have a longer shutter speed, 1/60th of a second or 1/50th of a second, you will have more light coming into your camera. And usually that's a good thing, right? Why not just keep it, at like 1/30th of a second? But what you start to do is introduce motion blur or camera shake. And when you have your camera, your hands aren't like perfectly still. You're gonna have a little shake while you're taking your photos, and that becomes more pronounced the longer your shutter speed is. So finding that balance while you're taking photos and you're choosing your shutter speed is very important. But keep in mind that as technology grows, so does what we can do with our cameras handheld. So my camera, for example, my lens has this VR technology that's called vibration reduction, so that I can use my camera handheld, and there'll be a little less motion blur than if that VR was off. Aperture also influences light. It's pretty much self-explanatory. The bigger the aperture is, you know, if you have 3.5 or 4.5, the more light will get in because that pupil of the camera is wider. And the lower the aperture, you know, 22 or 23, start using wide and narrow now because that lower higher thing, it gets very confusing. So the narrower the aperture, the less light that'll come into the camera because, you know, it's narrow versus super wide. Again, ISO is really self-explanatory. It's literally controlling the light in essence. So higher your ISO, the more light that's coming into your camera. The lower, the less light that's coming in. But again, be careful because that noise can come up in your photos. So let's take a scenario. Let's say you're taking a photo of a tree. Hopefully the trees wherever you live don't move. So the trees don't move, which means it's that motion blur from the subject moving is not there. So you can keep a fairly high shutter speed, something like 1/60th or 1/70th of a second. Although I like to keep as a rule, don't go below 1/25th of a second in order to minimize that motion blur. But of course you can go a little lower if vibration reduction is on. If this is a tree on a sunny day, you could probably have an ISO of 100 to 300. On a cloudy day, maybe go up to 500 to 600. And this brings an interesting point about aperture. Aperture changes something along with light, something called the depth of field. And the depth of field is basically a range within your photo where the focus of your camera is. And the focus is basically the sharp part of your image. And the wider your aperture is, the narrower this depth of field gets. So you'll notice that when you have aperture like 3.5, which is a very wide aperture, the background and very close foreground will be super blurred out. And what this is called is the bokeh effect. As you learn about photography, you might want the bokeh effect, you might not want the bokeh effect. One way you can add more bokeh effect is by widening the aperture. If you want to minimize it, say for a landscape shot, you would make the aperture narrower, so 12, 13, maybe even 22 if you want to go totally crazy with it. And that basically what it does, it widens the depth of field. And that depth of field this is your focus, and then everything outside is getting gradually blurred. Now, if you have a zoom lens like I do, let me get my camera. If you have a zoom lens like I do, I have a 55 to 200 attached on my camera right now. That focal length can also affect that bokeh or background blur. So at 55 millimeters, it's called millimeters, I have no idea why. But at 55 milliliters, the background blur will be a lot less than if you're at 200 millimeters. So keep that in mind, as the more you zoom in with your optical zoom lens, the more background blur you'll get. So back to that tree situation. So your focal length would probably be around 35 or 45 millimeters, or maybe even wider, like 27 millimeters, because you're not trying to get a super close in shot unless you're taking like a picture of a twig or one branch of the tree. Shutter speed 1/60th, 1/25th of a second, depending on your preference. ISO of 100 to 300 on a sunny day, and an aperture of whatever you want. Maybe you can just let your camera choose the aperture based on how much light it needs. There's really a lot of creative choices you got to make while taking these photos, even when you're looking at the light aspect of it. So you want to see, do I want that much background blur? Do I want a little motion blur? Do I want it to be completely sharp? Do I want to increase the ISO or widen the aperture or lower the shutter speed? These are all choices you have to make, and each camera is different, so those choices will be different for each camera. So as you shoot more and you take more photos, you'll learn about your camera and what tends to be the better choice. For example, some cameras, the ISO or the noise handling is really bad, so you might want to, your priority would be to minimize the ISO. One more scenario, say you're shooting wildlife. Say I love shooting birds, just going outside, shooting some pictures of birds, they look amazing. And you have to really think about multiple aspects about your subject when you're shooting something like wildlife. When you're shooting birds, you need to have a really fast shutter speed because they move super fast and they'll just like fly by your camera and you won't even know what's going on. So you'll need a 1/1000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second, so that you kind of get them frozen in motion right there. And your aperture will actually need to be a little narrower because you want to widen that depth of field. Since the bird will be moving in and out and in and out, you want to widen that depth of field so that if the bird just moves a little out of that depth of field, you'll still get more of the bird focus than if you had a super wide aperture like 3.5. And obviously the ISO would probably want to be minimized because you want as much as detail of the feathers of that bird and the eyes of that bird. So now there are a ton of other settings on your camera that you can play around with. For example, white balance or D-lighting or something like, I don't know, stuff like that. You know, white balance, D-lighting, and I would suggest just keeping these on auto or off for the moment as you learn to get to know your camera. And you can look at what does white balance do, what does D-lighting do. Just remember to go out there, take pictures with your camera, and get to know it. Just remember, if there's anything in this video that didn't make sense as far as the camera specific stuff, just look up the manual for your camera. I'm sure you can find some information on it. You know, there's some great forums out there. Stack Overflow probably has a photography version, or DP Photo Review, something like that. So go out there, take photos. This is Aryan Karani from Kid with the Camera. Remember to smash that like button and absolutely obliterate that subscribe button. Aryan Karani signing off.